I ran the macro again. 90,000 rows flickered on the screen, digital wires that moved when honest money slept. The coastal fog pressing against the bookstore's front windows was thick enough to mute the sound of the Pacific Ocean crashing against the seawall across the street. I sat at a small, scarred mahogany table in the back corner of the shop, a location I had claimed every morning for the past 3 weeks. The air inside smelled of roasting espresso beans, damp wool, and the distinct, dry vanilla scent of decaying paper. I adjusted the collar of my coat, turning my attention back to the glowing cells of my spreadsheet. The numbers were a puzzle, and my brain was wired for puzzles. They didn't lie, they didn't manipulate, and they didn't demand emotional bandwidth. They simply existed, waiting to be organized into a verifiable truth. I hit a sequence of keystrokes, indexing a column of offshore transfers for a maritime shipping firm. I took a sip of my black coffee. It was lukewarm, but I didn't care. I was entirely focused on the data. That was until a sharp, sudden sound broke my concentration. A heavy plastic file box hit the wooden floorboards near the front counter with a violent thud. I looked up, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Gia Turner was standing behind the massive oak counter of her bookstore. She was 37, 8 years older than me, with sharp features and hair the color of oxidized copper pulled into a messy clip. She was usually a force of calm efficiency, navigating the chaos of inventory deliveries and customer requests with a practiced, fluid grace. Today, her posture was completely rigid. She was staring at the glowing screen of her point-of-sale terminal, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were stark white against the wood. "Decline code 0 to 5, she whispered. Her voice barely carried over the low hum of the shop's heating system, but the sheer disbelief in her tone cut through the ambient noise. "That's not possible." She hit the escape key on her terminal, her fingers moving frantically over the plastic keys. She picked up the store's landline phone, dialing a number from memory without looking at the keypad. I watched her from the shadows of my corner. I should have gone back to my shipping audit. It wasn't my business, but the rigid tension in her shoulders was a structural anomaly, a deviation from the established baseline of this quiet sanctuary. And I investigated deviations for a living. "Yes, this is Gia Turner, owner of the Coastal Inkwell," she said into the receiver, her voice tightly controlled, masking the rising panic. "I'm trying to process my payroll batch for the week, and the terminal is returning a hard decline. It says the operating account is restricted. I need you to lift the hold immediately. I have a deposit clearing today." There was a long pause as the person on the other end spoke. I watched the color slowly drain from Gia's face, leaving her pale beneath the warm overhead pendant lights. "What do you mean?" "Flagged for systemic default?" she demanded. Her voice rose a fraction of an inch in volume, the professional mask slipping. "I haven't missed a commercial mortgage payment in 5 years. I have the receipts. I have the cleared checks." Another pause. The ambient noise of the bookstore seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only the sound of her rapid breathing and the distant, muffled crash of the ocean waves against the concrete barrier outside. "A mandatory audit?" she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Wilson Hernandez ordered a freeze on all operational funds pending an internal review? You can't do that without a 30-day written notice. I have employees to pay on Friday. I have vendor invoices due." She listened for another 10 seconds, her jaw clenched tight enough to pop. Then, the line clearly went dead. She slowly lowered the receiver to the cradle, missing it on the first attempt before setting it down heavily. She stood there in the quiet bookstore, surrounded by thousands of stories, completely isolated by the cold mechanics of a banking algorithm. I didn't think about it. I closed my laptop, the snap of the lid echoing in the quiet corner. I stood up, grabbing my coat and my heavy leather briefcase, and walked down the center aisle of the store, the floorboards creaking under my boots. When I reached the counter, she didn't look up. She was staring at a stack of unpaid invoices, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. "A code 0 to 5 on a commercial account isn't an automated security freeze," I said, my voice level, projecting a measured calm into the frantic space. "It's a manual override. Someone at the branch level authorized the restriction." She snapped her head up, her eyes wide, startled by my proximity. "Excuse me? You're on speakerphone," I explained, gesturing vaguely toward the terminal. I couldn't help but overhear. "Wilson Hernandez is the regional manager for Pacific Coast Trust. He doesn't manually freeze independent bookstore accounts unless he's building a pretextual case for asset seizure." Gia straightened her spine, a defensive wall slamming down instantly. I don't need an eavesdropping customer explaining my banking situation to me. I have it under control. It's a clerical error. It's not a clerical error, I countered, resting my briefcase on the counter. I'm Truett Evans. I'm a forensic accountant with the heiress group in the city. Wilson Hernandez wasn't just acting as a banker. He sits on the Historic District Advisory Committee, the kind of volunteer power that can fast-track a city inspection or validate a systemic default with one phone call. He's triggered a clause in your commercial loan agreement that allows the bank to call the full balance due immediately. He's trying to force you into foreclosure to seize the commercial real estate. She stared at me. The defensive anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by the terrifying realization that I was presenting a logical, undeniable pattern. Her previous business partner had left her in financial ruin years ago. I could see the ghost of that trauma tightening the muscles in her neck. "Why would he do that?" she asked, her voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "The property is zoned for historic retail. The margins are thin. Because the zoning board approved the new luxury condo development 2 blocks away last Tuesday," I stated, pulling a silver pen from my pocket. "Your lot just tripled in value. Hernandez wants the bank to take possession so they can sell it to the developers at a premium." She looked at the terminal, then back at me. "I have $14,000 in payroll clearing tomorrow. If the account is frozen, the checks bounce. My staff can't pay their rent. The vendors will halt shipments. I should call a lawyer. If the city posts a red tag or the bank liquidates the account, a lawyer won't stop the immediate freeze," I told her, opening my briefcase and pulling out a blank legal pad. "We need code compliance, not court. If we don't contest the math within 2 business days, the hold becomes the bank's official story. I need your general ledger, your last 12 months of bank statements, and the original commercial loan agreement you signed with Pacific Coast Trust." She crossed her arms, a shield against the sudden influx of information and the overwhelming pressure. "I don't even know you. And I certainly can't afford a corporate forensic accountant. Your hourly rate is probably more than my weekly gross. I don't want your money," I said, looking directly into her eyes. The copper color of her hair caught the dim light of the coastal fog, rolling against the glass. "This is a pro bono forensic review. It has no strings attached to you, this store, or anything else. I hate corrupt bankers. It offends my sense of order. If my presence here makes you uncomfortable after we review the files, I will hand this over to my partner, Mohammed, and you will never see me again. Your business stays protected either way." She held my gaze for a long, calculating moment. She was measuring my intent, searching for the hidden catch, the ulterior motive. She didn't find one, because there wasn't one. I simply saw a broken system, and I possessed the tools to fix it. "Fine," she said, turning on her heel. "Follow me to the office." The back office was a cramped space overflowing with cardboard boxes, publisher catalogs, and the sharp scent of printer toner. A single desk lamp cast a yellow pool of light over a chaotic pile of paperwork. Gia moved to a battered metal filing cabinet, unlocking the bottom drawer with a small key from her ring. She pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it onto the desk. "The loan agreement is from 6 years ago," she said, her tone clipped and professional. "When my grandfather transferred the deed to me, we had to refinance the mortgage to buy out a silent partner. Hernandez was the loan officer at the time." I pulled out the chair, sitting down at the desk. I untied the waxed string of the manila envelope, sliding the 40-page commercial loan agreement onto the scarred surface of the desk. The paper was heavy stock, filled with dense, 8-point serif font that blurred together if you didn't know how to segment the clauses. I didn't read it like a novel. I scanned it like a machine, my eyes searching for the specific structural traps banks use to leverage commercial clients. The room was silent except for the sound of my breathing and the rustle of the heavy paper as I turned the pages. Gia stood near the door, her arms still crossed, watching me work. I could feel her tension, a low-frequency vibration in the small room. It took me 12 minutes to find it. "Page 22, Section 8, Subsection C," I said, tapping the page with my silver pen. "The Material Adverse Change Clause. It states that the bank can declare a default if they determine, in their sole discretion, that your financial condition has deteriorated, even if you haven't missed a single payment." "That's illegal," Gia said, stepping closer to the desk. "They can't just decide I'm failing if the checks are clearing." "It's not illegal, But it requires them to provide mathematical justification, I corrected, keeping my focus on the paper. They have to prove your debt-to-income ratio violated the specific threshold outlined in the addendum. Did they request updated financials from you recently? She frowned, thinking back, her eyes narrowing as she mentally reviewed her calendar. Last month, Hernandez sent an email asking for the quarterly profit and loss statement. I sent it over. We had a slow quarter because of the seawall construction blocking foot traffic, but we were still in the black. He used the slow quarter to trigger the material adverse change clause, I concluded, closing the folder. He didn't wait for the annual review. He cherry-picked a low-revenue window to manufacture a default. It's a classic hostile maneuver. So, what do we do? She asked, her voice tight. We fight them in the ledger, I said, standing up. I need your raw data. Every receipt, every deposit slip, every inventory invoice from the last 90 days. I need to rebuild your balance sheet from the ground up to prove that the bank's mathematical justification for the freeze is fraudulent. That's 3 months of raw data, she said, her eyes widening as she looked around the cramped office. It's all in the accounting software, but the physical receipts to verify the digital entries are in the banker's boxes in the storage room. Then we better start pulling boxes, I told her, rolling up the sleeves of my dress shirt. The rest of the day shifted into a grueling marathon of data entry and cross-referencing. We moved the operation out to the main bookstore counter after closing time. The fog outside turned into a heavy, relentless coastal rain, drumming continuously against the large front windows. I set up a dual-monitor display using my laptop and her terminal. I created a master Excel sheet, building a dynamic cash flow model using index match functions to track every penny moving in and out of the coastal inkwell. Gia sat beside me, surrounded by open cardboard boxes, systematically handing me categorized stacks of receipts and invoices. My phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID flashed. Mohammed Wright, my supervising partner at the firm. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up. Truett, Mohammed's voice crackled through the speaker. The client for the maritime audit is asking for the preliminary findings by Friday. You haven't uploaded the offshore transfer logs to the secure server. I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling the pressure mount. I hit a snag on a secondary account correlation. I need 48 more hours. You don't have 48 hours, Mohammed warned, his tone losing its usual warmth. This is a Tier 1 client. If we miss the deadline, the firm loses the retainer. Drop whatever side project you're entertaining and finish the logs. I'll have it by Friday morning, I promised, hanging up the phone before he could argue. I placed the device face down on the wood. Gia was looking at me, a stack of utility bills in her hand. You have a massive deadline. I have a schedule, I corrected smoothly, refusing to let her carry my professional burden. She wasn't a passive victim waiting for a rescue. She was a shield mate. She knew her inventory, she knew her margins, and she anticipated my requests before I made them. When I asked for the utility disbursements, she already had the folder open. When I needed the vendor credit memos, she had them highlighted with a yellow marker. At 1:12 a.m., the payroll portal on her screen flashed a stark, red warning. Final submission, window 6 hours. The fatigue began to set in heavily. The temperature in the bookstore had dropped significantly, the draft from the old, unsealed windows cutting through the large room. I was running a complex pivot table to reconcile the daily credit card batches against the bank deposit timestamps, my eyes burning fiercely from the screen glare. I watched Gia from my peripheral vision. She was sitting on a wooden stool, sorting through a pile of petty cash slips. She shivered, a small, involuntary movement, pulling her thick wool sweater tighter around her shoulders. I didn't say anything. I saved my spreadsheet, locking the data. I stood up and walked to the back break room. I found the small ceramic space heater she kept under a desk, plugged it in near her stool, and angled the warm air directly toward her boots. I then went to the industrial espresso machine, brewed a fresh pot of dark roast, and poured 2 heavy ceramic mugs. I walked back to the counter and set a mug down exactly 2 inches from her right hand. She stopped sorting. She looked at the mug, steam rising into the cold air, then down at the space heater humming quietly near her legs. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable in the dim light of the monitors. You don't have to do that, she said quietly. I'm fine. The ambient temperature is 62 degrees. I replied, sitting back down at my laptop and adjusting my screen brightness. Cold causes muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue leads to data entry errors. I need your data accurate. A tiny, Unexpected smile broke through the tension around her mouth. It was a fleeting thing, but it changed the entire architecture of her face, softening the sharp edges of her exhaustion. She reached out and pulled a small, heavy stock bookmark from a display stand, clicking her pen and writing 2 words on it before sliding it across the counter to me. Strictly data. Strictly, I agreed, glancing at the bookmark before turning my attention back to the screen. For the next 3 days, the bookstore became a war room. I negotiated the temporary extension with Mohammed, taking personal time and burning midnight oil to balance both the maritime audit and Gia's defense. We worked in the quiet hours before opening and the long, silent hours after closing. The dynamic between us settled into a rhythm of high-efficiency collaboration. On Thursday afternoon, I hit a massive wall. I was staring at the reconciliation summary for the third quarter. The numbers didn't balance. There was a phantom deduction of $4,000 that appeared on the bank's ledger but didn't exist in Gia's point-of-sale data or her physical receipts. "Gia," I called out. She was across the store, adjusting a display of local history books on a towering oak shelf. "I need the September statements again." She walked over, her brow furrowed, handing me the heavy black binder. "What's wrong?" "There's a discrepancy," I said, flipping rapidly to the September sheet. "The bank's internal ledger shows a $4,000 debit on the 15th, categorized as a commercial risk assessment fee. Did you authorize this?" She leaned in to read the line item, then stepped back instantly, like the numbers printed on the page burned her eyes. "No," she said, her voice tightening into a knot. "I never authorized a risk assessment fee. I've never even heard of that specific charge." "It's a ghost fee," I explained, my jaw clenching as the pieces of the puzzle slammed together. "Hernandez manually debited your account for an arbitrary, exorbitant fee to artificially lower your daily average balance. He manufactured the exact financial deterioration he needed to trigger the material adverse change clause." Gia stepped back again, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "He stole from my operating account to justify freezing it? It's systemic fraud," I confirmed, highlighting the line item in bright yellow on the screen. "And I guarantee he didn't cover his tracks perfectly. He needed a corresponding authorization form to process a manual fee of this size." "I never signed anything," she insisted, her voice rising with panic and defensive energy. "I swear, Truett, I read every document. After what my ex-partner did, I never sign anything without reading the fine print." "I believe you," I said instantly, shutting down the panic before it could spiral. "Which means he forged the authorization, or he buried it in a document you signed for something else." The next morning, a courier set a sealed envelope on the counter. Gia's pen scratched the signature line on the delivery tablet, then her fingers didn't stop shaking when she tore the heavy paper open. I was standing near the espresso machine when I saw her freeze. She pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy bank letterhead. I watched her read the first paragraph. The color vanished from her face completely. The paper trembled violently in her grip. She didn't speak. She picked up her phone, her thumb swiping to open her banking app. I walked over, looking at the screen over her shoulder. Every single account wore the same stark red banner: restricted. Her thumb hovered over a checking account labeled groceries, then dropped, defeated. "It's not just the operating account," she whispered, her voice entirely hollow. "They initiated a cross-default protocol. They've frozen my personal checking account, my savings, and my grandfather's trust fund. Everything is locked. I can't even buy a gallon of milk." The bank wasn't just trying to take the property. They were trying to starve her out of a legal defense. She dropped the papers onto the counter. She turned away from me, walking quickly toward the back office. I followed her. When I stepped into the cramped room, she was standing by the window, her back to me, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. Her shoulders were shaking, a silent, desperate reaction to the overwhelming weight of the attack. I stopped just inside the doorway. I swallowed the regulation speech on my tongue. I didn't quote banking laws or cite legal precedents. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, flipped it over, and set it face down on the wooden desk. No screens, no data, just absolute, undivided attention. "Look at me," I commanded gently. She turned around. Her breathing was jagged, tears of sheer frustration standing in her eyes. "They have Wilson Hernandez, a middle management bureaucrat who made a fatal error," I told her, my voice a quiet rumble of absolute certainty. I walked to the desk, picked up the September bank statement, and tapped the routing number attached to the fraudulent fee. Here's the footprint. He committed wire fraud to trigger a commercial default. I have the timestamps. I have the routing logs. I have the irrefutable mathematical proof of his manipulation. She stared at me, the panic in her eyes slowly meeting the immovable wall of my competence. We are not going to court to beg for an injunction, I continued, holding her gaze. We are going to the regional arbitration hearing, and we are going to dismantle his career. She exhaled a long, shaky breath. The frantic energy began to drain out of the room, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. She reached up and wiped a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. Okay, she whispered, her voice steadying. What's the next step? We find the forged authorization form, I said, picking my phone back up. The second obstacle hit us 48 hours before the scheduled bank arbitration hearing. We were sitting on the cold floor of the bookstore after hours, surrounded by boxes of old vendor contracts, searching for any document Hernandez might have used to copy her signature. The heating system had kicked off for the night, leaving the store freezing cold. We were both wearing heavy coats, our breath pluming in the dim light. Gia pulled a manila folder from the bottom of a banker's box. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. She stopped. Truett, she said, her voice tight. I looked over. She handed me a single sheet of paper. It was a standard commercial account maintenance form, dated exactly 2 days before the $4,000 risk assessment fee was debited. At the bottom, in blue ink, was Gia's signature. I signed it, she whispered, her voice filled with heavy self-recrimination. I remember now. I went into the branch to update my business address, and the teller handed me a stack of maintenance forms. I just signed the bottom line. I didn't read the fine print. I took the paper, holding it under the direct light of the desk lamp. The text was microscopic. Buried in the third paragraph of the boilerplate language was a clause authorizing the bank to conduct internal risk assessments at the client's expense. I ruined it, she said, pulling her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on her arms. He didn't forge it. I gave him the authorization. The freeze is legal. She looked entirely defeated. She thought she had handed the enemy the weapon. I didn't agree. I placed the paper flat on the wooden floorboards. I pulled a small magnifying glass from my briefcase, knelt down, and leaned over the document, examining the structure of the text line by line. You didn't ruin anything, I said, my voice sharp and analytical. Look at the margins. She frowned, leaning closer, being careful not to let her shoulder brush against mine. What about them? The first 2 paragraphs use a standard Helvetica font, 12-point, with standard kerning, I explained, pointing the tip of my silver pen at the text. The third paragraph, the risk assessment clause, uses an Arial font, 11-point, with compressed kerning. The ink density is slightly different, leaving a faint shadow line above the text block. She looked at me, confusion replacing the guilt. I don't understand. This isn't an original document, I stated, the adrenaline of the discovery sharpening my focus. It's a composite photocopy. Hernandez took a standard maintenance form, pasted the risk assessment clause over the original text, and photocopied it before handing it to the teller for you to sign. It's a fraudulent instrument. Gia stared at the paper, then up at me. Can we prove that? I don't need a forensic document examiner to prove it, I said, a dangerous smile touching the corner of my mouth. I just need the original digital file from the bank's internal server, and I know exactly how to force them to produce it. The climax arrived on a Tuesday morning at the corporate headquarters of Pacific Coast Trust. The arbitration room was a sterile expanse of glass and polished mahogany, designed to intimidate. Wilson Hernandez sat on the opposite side of the massive conference table, flanked by 2 bank attorneys. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of profound boredom, projecting the arrogant confidence of a man who believed the system was designed to protect him. I sat next to Gia. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her posture perfect, her expression an impenetrable mask of professional calm. I had prepped her on the strategy. We were a united front. The bank's lead attorney, an older man with silver hair and a silk tie, opened the proceedings. We are here to review the commercial account restriction placed on the coastal inkwell. The bank asserts that the client triggered a material adverse change clause due to a significant decline in daily average balances, resulting in an automatic freeze to protect the bank's collateral. Hernandez leaned forward, steepling his fingers. It's a straightforward risk mitigation protocol. Miss Turner's business is failing. We are simply executing the terms of the loan agreement to prevent further loss. That is a fabricated narrative, I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I didn't wait for permission to speak. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out three thick, perfectly bound forensic audit reports. I slid one across the polished mahogany to the lead attorney, one to the arbitrator, and one directly to Hernandez. "My name is Truett Evans," I continued, meeting Hernandez's eyes with absolute coldness. "I am a forensic accountant representing the Coastal Inkwell. The report in front of you contains a full, line-by-line reconciliation of my client's operational cash flow over the last 36 months. As you will see on page 4, her business is not failing. Her revenue is up 6% year over year." Hernandez sneered, not bothering to open the report. "Your internal spreadsheets mean nothing. The bank's official ledger shows a severe drop in operational capital on September 15th. The math is the math. The math on September 15th reflects a fraudulent debit of $4,000 initiated by your terminal, Mr. Hernandez." I countered sharply, the trap closing. "A fee categorized as a risk assessment." The lead attorney frowned, flipping to page 4 of the report, his eyes scanning my methodology. "Mr. Hernandez, did you initiate a manual fee assessment?" With the client's explicit written authorization, Hernandez defended smoothly, though a slight tremor of annoyance touched his voice. "I have the signed maintenance form in the file." This was the moment. I looked at Gia. She didn't hesitate. She reached into her sleek leather portfolio, pulled out a clear plastic sleeve containing the photocopied maintenance form, and placed it precisely in the center of the mahogany table. "That is the form your teller handed me to sign," Gia said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "However, pursuant to the federal discovery rules of financial arbitration, we demand the immediate production of the bank's original digital template for Form 402B, timestamped prior to September 15th. Hernandez's arrogant expression faltered for a fraction of a second. The micro-expression was everything. He knew he was caught. "That's an unreasonable request," the bank's attorney argued instinctively, shifting in his leather chair. "The signed physical document is sufficient evidence." "It is not sufficient when the document is a fraudulent composite," I interjected, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table. I didn't raise my voice. I lowered it, forcing them to listen closely. The clause authorizing the fee is printed in a different font family, with compressed kerning, indicating it was manually pasted onto the boilerplate form before copying. "If you refuse to produce the digital original to verify the text alignment, I will file a formal complaint with the Federal Banking Commission alleging systemic wire fraud, forgery, and predatory lending practices by this branch manager." The room went dead silent. The threat of a federal investigation was the nuclear option, and I had just dropped it on the table with verifiable evidence. The lead attorney looked at the document in the center of the table, then looked at Hernandez. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. The bank lawyer was a pragmatist. He recognized a losing battle and a massive regulatory liability when he saw one. "Mr. Hernandez," the attorney said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "did you alter a bank document to force a commercial default?" Hernandez opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was a confession. The attorney closed his folder with a sharp snap. He looked at the arbitrator, then at me. "The bank will withdraw the material adverse change claim immediately. We will initiate the process to lift the holds. The bank will lift all holds by the close of business today," I stated flatly, refusing to yield an inch. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my briefcase and slid it across the table. "You will also reduce her interest rate by 50 basis points and credit all account maintenance fees for the next 12 months to compensate for the business disruption. You will sign this today, or the forensic report goes to the federal regulators tomorrow morning." The attorney read the single page. He knew he had no leverage. He picked up his gold pen and signed the document, finalizing the terms. We won. Without raising our voices, without a messy court battle, we dismantled the threat using nothing but process, composure, and facts. The aftermath was a quiet, profound relief. We walked out of the corporate headquarters and into the bright, crisp afternoon air. The fog had burned off, leaving the city skyline sharp against a blue sky. Gia stopped on the sidewalk. She pulled out her phone, opening her banking app. I watched her screen as the red restriction banners vanished, replaced by the healthy, green balances of her operating and personal accounts. The money was free. The store was safe. She looked up from the screen. She didn't cheer or cry. She just let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of the last 4 weeks finally leaving her body. "It's over," she whispered. It's over, I confirmed, adjusting the strap of my heavy briefcase. The new terms are ironclad. He can never touch your accounts again. She looked at me, the coastal sunlight catching the copper in her hair. The professional battle was won, but the boundary between us remained. We were forensic accountant and client. I need to get back to my firm, I said, my voice slipping back into its familiar, compartmentalized tone. I have a shipping audit that is severely behind schedule. Right, she said, her smile faltering slightly, masking the disappointment behind a professional veneer. Of course. Send me your final invoice for the consultation, Truett. I insist on paying it. The invoice is zero. It was pro bono, I replied quietly. And, to be clear, our professional arrangement ends here. If you never want to see me again, the legal defense stands perfectly on its own. I gave her a brief, professional nod, turned, and walked toward the subway station. I didn't look back. I needed distance. I needed the predictable safety of my spreadsheets. For the next 2 weeks, I buried myself in maritime shipping data. I worked late, drank too much black coffee, and successfully traced the missing funds for Mohammed. My firm praised the recovery. Everything was exactly as it should be. The numbers balanced perfectly, but my mind didn't. I opened my briefcase on a Tuesday evening to pull out a reference ledger. Tucked between the pages of the heavy maritime file was a small, heavy stock paper rectangle. I pulled it out. It was the bookmark from the store. She had slipped it into my files before the arbitration. Strictly data, with a small hand-drawn smiley face next to the text. I stared at the ink. I had compartmentalized my life so efficiently that I had optimized myself into total isolation. On a Friday afternoon, I sat in my sterile glass office, staring at my digital calendar. The afternoon was completely blocked out for a compliance review. I reached forward, grabbed my mouse, and deleted the compliance review. In the blank 4 p.m. slot, I typed 2 words, Gia Turner. I treated it like a commitment, a hard deadline. At exactly 5 p.m., I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the coastal inkwell. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, clear sound in the quiet space. The store smelled exactly as I remembered espresso and decaying paper. Gia was behind the massive oak counter, ringing up a customer. She looked up when the bell chimed. When she saw me, her hands froze over the cash register. I didn't say anything. I walked down the center aisle, stopping exactly 2 feet from the counter. I waited patiently while she finished the transaction and handed the customer their receipt. When the customer left, the store was empty. Truett, she said, her voice a mix of surprise and guarded caution. Is something wrong with the bank? The bank is fine, I said, resting my hands on the edge of the counter. I looked at her, abandoning the professional distance, letting the raw honesty of the moment stand without a shield. I finished my shipping audit. Congratulations, she said softly, studying my face, her posture remaining perfectly professional. Why are you here? Because I spent the last 14 days looking at perfectly balanced ledgers, and none of them made sense without you sitting next to me, I admitted, the truth feeling heavy and necessary in the quiet air. I'm not here as a forensic accountant. The pro bono work is completely unattached to this conversation. But if you are willing, I'd like to take you to dinner. Optional. No strings. She stared at me, the guarded caution melting away, replaced by a profound, radiant warmth. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached under the counter, pulled out a small, handwritten sign that said, "Closed for a private event," and walked over to the front door, flipping the lock with a definitive click. She walked back to the counter, her eyes locked on mine. I have a neighborhood business association meeting at 7 o'clock, she said, her voice steady, taking total agency of the moment. It's a formal event. I want you to come with me. She wasn't just accepting a dinner date, she was offering a public choice. I'll be there, I told her, my voice a quiet vow. At 7 o'clock, I walked into the local community center wearing a dark, tailored suit. The room was crowded with local business owners, city council members, and neighborhood residents. When Gia saw me enter, she didn't hesitate. She excused herself from a conversation with the mayor, walked directly across the crowded floor, and stopped beside me. She didn't ask for permission. She simply slipped her hand through the crook of my arm, anchoring herself against my side in front of the entire room. Everyone, Gia said, her voice carrying clearly over the ambient chatter as the crowd turned toward us. "I'd like to introduce Truett Evans. He's the man who protected this bookstore when it mattered most. And he's the person I trust more than anyone." She claimed me publicly, without grand speeches or chaotic drama. She chose me with absolute, unshakable certainty. I stood beside her, feeling the solid, reassuring weight of her presence against my arm. Knowing that for the first time in my life, the most important thing I had secured couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The bell chimed. The fog pressed the glass. I still showed up on time. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.